Hi, everybody. I'm Paula Wilson. I'm Equity Arc's Member Services and Communications Manager. I'm joined by our Associate Director, Miggy Capsuto. Thanks all for being here today for this grant writing workshop. We know that funding your equity-based music programs is a top priority, so we're very excited to have Chris Antasio to lead this session. And so I'm going to go ahead and turn the floor over to Chris, and we can get started.
Thanks, Paula. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. I'm joining you from upstate New York, although I live in the Bay Area right now. And it's great to see people from all over the place. I've never run one of these before through Zoom, so this is very exciting. And I appreciate your patience in case I screw anything up technology-wise. I guess I'll start with just a quick introduction. My name is Chris Santantasio. I've been working with arts-based nonprofits pretty much for my entire career. I started out as a music teacher. I taught band and chorus for 5 years in public school. And while I was doing that, I started getting involved with nonprofits, and grant writing was just the first thing that I tried to do as a nonprofit professional. And I made a lot of mistakes and had some really great mentors, learned a lot along the way. And sort of that kind of became my focus. So I don't want to belabor my introduction too much, but I have been working with nonprofits for a while. I've worked with, I don't know, probably close to a dozen from the East Coast to the Midwest to the West Coast. So I'm really excited to be with you all today. So here's our agenda. So basically, I'm kind of thinking about dividing our session today into, well, I guess 5 sessions. We're going to start off talking about some trends that I think will be relevant to all of your work. And then the middle 2 sections, we're just going to go over some best practices. And I'm really going to be relying on some of the more experienced grant writers in the group today to chime in and give your own thoughts on the best practices that I'm presenting here today. I'm excited that we have kind of a mix of more experienced and individuals who are newer to the grant writing and research process. And then for me, the most exciting part of the presentation is going to be a little module I put together on storytelling. I think when we think of a grant narrative or a grant proposal, a lot of people talk about data. A lot of people talk about demographics and the hard facts and research, and that stuff is all very important. But something that I've learned along the way is that if you want to stand out, if you want your proposal to really speak to someone on an emotional as well as an intellectual level, incorporating some elements of storytelling is a great way to go. And then we'll finish off with a little Q&A and a little bit more of a discussion so we can share some ideas. All right, so here's our first little section here. I'm going to give you a moment to just read this brief quote from Ann-Mei Chang, CEO of Candid, and then I'll launch into a little bit of background for you. All right. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Candid, it's a nonprofit that was formed, I think, in 2019 from the merger of GuideStar and Foundation Center. GuideStar is sort of the place where you go to learn about nonprofits. Foundation Center is the place where you go to learn about philanthropists and foundations. So something that what has been a recurring theme over the past few years, obviously, is that philanthropists are taking a much more direct and robust approach to issues of racial equity and justice. But I want to hear from all of you first. We were going to do a little poll, but I think we're having trouble with the poll situation. So think about your response to this question. And at the end of this section, we're going to have a little bit of a discussion. So yeah, just think about this and we'll come back to the discussion once we get through a little bit more background. All right. So I wanted to give you not just one voice, but a few voices. when it comes to how philanthropy as a sector has responded to the calls for racial equity and justice after the murder of George Floyd in 2020. And what we're going to see is that depending on who you ask, you'll get different answers. So many foundations, and I put the MacArthur quote here because it's kind of an exception to the rule. Many foundations believe they are doing significantly better by providing more funding than ever before for racial equity and racial justice programs, nonprofits, and initiatives. However, we were starting at a very low place. So in 2020, the percentage of philanthropic dollars that were going towards such initiative hovered around 6 to 7%. So there was a lot of room to grow. So if you ask the, thank you, Paula, if you ask the philanthropists, a lot of them will say they're doing great. They're putting a lot more dollars towards these programs. They're reforming their application processes to make it easier for smaller nonprofits run by people of color that serve such populations to apply for funding. They're putting more funding towards it. But there's a few things that are complicating this. One is that we have some huge funders, massive funders. Mackenzie Scott, whose organization is called Yield Giving, the Ford Foundation, they are pouring over $1 billion into the sector over the last few years, which could be skewing things, right? So you have these two big funders that are giving all this money, but is that really a change in the sector as a whole, or are they skewing the data? This is a question that hasn't really been answered yet, and I'm excited to hear what you all think in a little bit. So while it's beyond the scope of what we're talking about here to go into these other trends, I wanted to point them out because I think they're particularly relevant to organizations seeking funding for racial equity and racial justice programs. One of them is that when you look at the entire landscape of philanthropy in the United States, most funds, the largest group, comes from individuals, actually. Foundations are a smaller portion of overall giving, but that amount is growing, right? So over the past few years, and this could be related to economic factors, but individuals and foundations, the balance is shifting, right? So foundations are starting to give more of a total of overall funding, although still less when compared to individuals. But what that means for grant writers and organizations is that they may be relying even more on foundations for more of their operating funds than they had in the past. It's too early to know if this trend is going to continue, but and then another issue you may encounter as you're doing research is that because of the pandemic, a lot of the important data that we rely on to determine things like how large of a gift we can request from a foundation, where a organization's funds are coming from, important foundational elements of grant research, it's just hard to find recent data on that because the IRS hasn't released a lot of it yet. So that's causing kind of some issues for many of us. I'm sure some of you in the group have noticed that as well. And then the last thing, which is an interesting development in how foundations are defining capacity building. Traditionally, capacity building has included things like training for staff and things that will improve your staff's ability to do work. But that doesn't really help a lot of us, right? A lot of us need more people, not just training for the people that we have. So something that I hope you will think about is when you're approaching either new funders or funders that have been supporting you for a while, is to ask them, hey, what do you mean when you say capacity building? Because to us, capacity building means XYZ. How does that sound to you? And by approaching a foundation in that way, you may be able to obtain more flexible donations, right? So you may be able to use capacity building funds for more general operating tasks and budget items. That's what I was looking for. All right. So now let's do the discussion here. Let's just do, if you want to chime in and either respond directly to the poll about whether or not you're noticing this increased trend in racial equity and racial justice giving, Or if you don't have a response to that, you can just speak about a challenge that you're facing, and we can just go around and have people chime in.
I guess I'll be the brave person to go first then. Hi, I'm sorry I joined a couple of minutes late. So if I missed, my name is Sarah Vanderplug and I'm project manager for the Chicago Musical Pathways Initiative. And I think one of the, I do grant writing for, sorry, my dog wants to participate. I do grant writing for another organization that I'm involved with on a part-time basis as well. And I know with that organization, we have seen that many of the local grant opportunities, at least in the Chicagoland area, have been emphasizing and requiring more documentation of support for BIPOC leadership, or at least in the arts space, having equity as a major sort of mission statement or goal to some of what we're doing. And in the case of that organization, that's been a major win because that's been a part of the identity of that organization for a long time. I'll say some of what is challenging for us with CMPI is the fact that because we were started by the Mellon Grant, and our program exists, we have another sort of parent organization that serves as our fiscal sponsor. We don't have our own 501c3. And so a lot of the grant opportunities and the things that we would love to apply for, we are not eligible to apply for ourselves just for our work. And some of the funders are already giving to our fiscal sponsor, and there is fear that if they apply for something for us, that will cannibalize the giving to their organization. And so trying to figure out that balance has been a real challenge just because of how we are structured.
Thank you, Sarah. Let's have a couple more people chime in.
I guess, as a young organization, one of the things that you find with foundation funding is that many funders want to see a certain number of years of programmatic activity before they're willing to give you money. And sometimes, you need the money to start your programmatic activities. So finding that balance of funders who are willing to be a little adventurous with you, and then also just finding the support to embark on programs without the support of big foundations is certainly, a fun time.
We have some notes in the chat about people are just interested in learning about experiences. I wonder, Chris, if not to put you on the spot, but curious with your years of experience, kind of what your observations in a more practical sense when it comes to the challenges in grant writing.
Yeah, so a lot of it depends on where a foundation or where an organization is in their development, right? As was mentioned, a young foundation without much of a track record is going to rely much more on vision casting and highlighting the resources and the expertise that's at their disposal as a way to indicate the promise and the potential, right? And that's a story in and of itself. A more established organization, one that's looking to grow, right, faces different challenges because the funders that have been supporting them for a long time, they may outgrow them. One of the foundations I'm working with right now, or organizations I'm working with right now, has been operating for over 10 years, and they're looking to grow, and we're kind of having a hard time finding funders that are going to support a larger organization. A lot of them cap out their budgets at, $1.5 million, $2 million, and once you surpass that, well, you've got to find some new sources of revenue, which can be challenging. And grant writing can't solve all of these issues, right? There's also, revenue-based models where an organization may look to start generating revenue of their own outside of philanthropic dollars, right? There's major gifts, there's individual giving drives, capital campaigns, things like that. So I do want to make sure we stay focused on just grants and grant writing, but just know that there is other segments of revenue out there that could be explored as well. And yeah, I guess one other thing I would highlight before we move on is that in the interest of, as Sarah pointed out, right, in the interest of serving organizations that are BIPOC-led or serve BIPOC communities, foundations are asking for a lot more information. And sometimes it can be difficult, especially for smaller organizations, to present all that information. You know, are you collecting enough information to know how many of your people that you serve are considered low income? How do you even determine what low income is for your area? This all takes time, this takes resources, this takes people power. And so something that I've noticed is that it can be a mismatch, right? Foundations want to give to certain organizations, but in order to prove that you qualify, you have to jump through additional administrative hoops, right? And so this can cause, again, a mismatch. There's a comment here that I'm just looking at in the chat about quantitative and qualitative data. Exactly, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about that later, and how does an organization come up with such data when, you know, it can require anything from a prolonged multi-year study, right, conducted in partnership with a research organization, right? That's a massive investment, right? Could be hundreds of thousands of dollars over a number of years to obtain the kind of qualitative data that a foundation may find compelling, right? Are there alternatives to that? I think there are some, but yeah, we're going to explore that a little bit in the next section. So yeah, shall we continue here? Thank you for all that participation. All right. So let's start with some research. The most successful fundraising programs are the ones that undertake a thoughtful and thorough planning process, right? In an ideal world, we would apply to every foundation whose funding priorities are aligned with the mission of our organization and programs. But unfortunately, most of us just don't have those resources. Even the largest organizations I've worked for have had to say, no, we don't have the capacity to apply for this. We'll have to put this aside for next year. So we need to choose our applications and our organizations that we're going to apply for very carefully, right? We need to look at an application in its entirety before we decide to apply for it to make sure we have the time and energy required to complete it. We need to get buy-in from our staff and from our board who could potentially support us as we're pursuing maybe more involved grant applications. We need to give relevant stakeholders the opportunity to have their voices heard, right? But we also need to set reasonable expectations. Something I will never, ever, ever say, no matter how good of a fit, no matter how strong of a relationship you have with a funder, I will never, ever say to a client or to an executive director that this grant is a sure thing, because there are so many factors outside of your control as a grant writer, as an organization. What goes on in board meetings at philanthropic organizations is very often a black box. We just don't know. So we can do the best we can with the resources that we have. And an important part of that is the planning process. So the first place that I advise people to start, and this is definitely for people who are newer to grant research and writing, is to start with your network. Okay, if you have some loyal funders, those are the ones that you start with. They could provide not only additional funding, right? You could have a conversation with them, say, hey, thank you for this $5,000 last year. We're thinking of increasing our gift to $7,500 or $10,000. Let's have a conversation about that. You can also ask them to help connect you with other funders, right? The philanthropic community is pretty small, right? People serve on multiple boards. So starting with your board, starting with the boards and the staff of your current funders is the first step. The next thing you want to do is look at what relationships you might have that have been underexploited. Rejected applications can be a place to start. If you get a response from an organization, a negative response from a funder, go back to them and say, hey, is there anything that we could have done to improve this application? What are your giving priorities looking like for next year? Next, look at lapsed funders, right? Sometimes funders fall off the map for a whole ton of reasons. Maybe it has nothing to do with your organization. Maybe it has to do with their capacity or their giving priorities. So, after a year break, go back to that lapsed funder and test the waters. Send them a report, have a meeting, see how they're doing. Look locally, right? Even a foundation whose giving priorities don't necessarily align with the work that you're doing, if they're local, they have a vested interest in your local community, right? So you may be able to start a conversation with them. And this is important for another sort of trend that I didn't mention in the last section, but philanthropists are working together more than ever now. They're sort of forming these coalitions, right? So that can be a way to, build a relationship with one funder, even if it's not perfect alignment, right? They may be able to connect you with someone else in their given cohort. And then, of course, looking at your extended network, right? Your board members of your partner organizations, things like that. So that's always the first place that I start. You've gone through your network, you've exhausted all of the options that are on the table for you, and now it's time to branch out and find some new funders. So what do you do? I would say if you're going to hire someone to do grant research, this is the point where you would do it. Don't hire someone before you've fully exploited your current network, right? Because they're a new person, they're coming from outside your organization, they don't know your network, right? So don't start, in my opinion, don't start paying someone until you've really gone through your current network. So where do you go? Well, you've got some no-cost options at your disposal. You can run all kinds of Google searches that will lead you to different organizations. That's kind of a no-brainer. You can look at organizations that are similar to yours, right? So I'm working with a new arts-based nonprofit in Philadelphia. They're focusing on performing arts, specifically theater. So I'm going to go to Theater Philadelphia. I'm going to look through their website. I'm going to find all the theater organizations. I'm going to go to their websites. I'm going to read their annual reports. I'm going to read their giving pages. I'm going to find out who's giving to them, right? Because if they're giving to a similar organization, there's clearly some overlap there in their giving priorities. You can go right to the government, federal government's website, to the IRS. And if you know the name of a foundation, you can search for them and pull up their 990 form, which is the tax form that typically indicates not only where their income comes from, but also where their income goes, right? So typically it's towards the end of the 990. It's usually an attachment or an appendix to the 990, which will give a list of where they're giving and the number of gifts, right? These are public documents, so they're accessible to you. Of course, we run into the issue I mentioned earlier about there being a little bit of a delay in releasing those. You can also go to you can subscribe to the Federal Register. This is where the federal government releases their new RFPs for different funding streams that you can explore. If you subscribe to it's free. You subscribe to it, you get an email every day telling you what new opportunities are available. That's definitely something I recommend if you're looking for larger federal grants. And also look at your state agencies, right? In Pennsylvania, we have the Pennsylvania Council on the Arts. There's a Humanities Council, I believe. But also look at state agencies that are adjacent to the work that you do. So Department of Health and Human Services sometimes has opportunities for nonprofits that operate either in the art space or in racial equity or racial justice. Obviously, the criminal justice system in each state has grants and things like that. So those are all places to go. So if you've exhausted sort of all the free options and you still feel like you need some more avenues to explore, there are some subscription-based options. I'm going to do a very, very quick demo of two of them here. The first is Candid. They have the foundation directory online. And the second one is Instrumental. So I'm going to share. Paula, can I share my screen now? Thank you. All right. So real quick, This is Candid's Foundation Directory, Foundation Center. You can do just like a quick search here, but I always prefer to go through and do the advanced search. So the basic subscription is, if you do it monthly, it's like $50 a month. If you do it annually, it comes down to like $30 a month. But the basic will definitely get you started. You can search your subject area, you can search your geographic focus. I know, let's do music, education, or maybe I'll just do music. Arts and culture, performing arts, music, let's do music. Geographic area, I'll just pick Philadelphia. You can go even more in depth, right? Who are you searching for, age groups? Let's go for search by age group. We can, if you click the little drop down, should be able to, there we go. All right. Let's do children and youth. And let's leave it at that. Let's see what we come up with here. I don't need a tour. All right. And then you'll get your list, right? It usually arranges them by the, I mean, however you want. You can have them arranged by total assets, by total giving. That's probably more useful. All right. So there you go. Biggest, according to Foundation Directory Online, Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, one of the largest funders in that area. We can keep scrolling down. You can find here William Penn, that's a pretty prominent one. And then when you get to their entry, you can look at all kinds of important and helpful data. Where's the money going is very important, right? Obviously, you want to make sure you're in a state where the money is actually going. How big are the grants? That will help you determine your ask. And then for all the rest of this stuff down here, I would recommend just going to their website. That's not an option all the time, right? Some don't have websites. So this will be as comprehensive as you're going to get. And then the last thing I would do when you're doing this kind of research is to see if you can get down to the board members and keep track of board members as well and staff. If you have some sort of database that you use, because these will be people that will be useful for you as you're pursuing grant opportunities. So that's the Foundation Directory. You can get a more expensive, like a professional membership, which goes up to like several $100s a month, which gives you, they give you like the very most recent, I think they update it more frequently, and they give you a bit more finer grain detail on some of the options. And then the other one I wanted to walk you through real quick is Instrumental.
Sorry, can I interject
Yeah.
for a second?
Yeah.
I'm from Philadelphia, and I just wanted to mention that at least in Philly and possibly other major cities as well, you can try to go and find that level of detail at your library.
Mm-hmm.
You might be able to, like we have a thing where you just go and if you have a library card, you can get a computer for 2 hours and you can use the advanced search for 2 hours. And so I don't know if that's in other cities, but it's a resource we have access to.
Yeah.
So maybe you could check.
Thank you very much. Actually, when I lived in Philly, I used to go to the Central Library and do that almost every day. So yeah, there are, if you go to the Candid website, you can search where their little foundation centers are. They're usually at libraries, different places around the country. So yeah, definitely search that. Excellent recommendation. All right, now I wanted to show you Instrumental. So Instrumental is it's kind of a little bit different. If you want to you sort of create a project and then use the project to sort of give you different options and possibilities. So basically you'll create a project. Actually here, why don't I just go to one that's already in existence? That way it won't take us forever. Get the project here. All right. So basically, you name your project. and you select your type of organization, your location, your fields of work. So you can really sort of get a little more granular than you can with Foundation Directory. What you're trying to get funding for, right? So project versus general operating. And then it will spit out a whole bunch of options for you. And at this point, it gives you basically the same information that Foundation Directory does, but I think the interface is easier to navigate. It's a little more user-friendly. They pull all this information directly from the websites, which Foundation Directory doesn't do, or at least not as often. So you can actually go to the funder. Oh, so the other interesting thing is it breaks it down by funding opportunity and funder. So each funder could have multiple funding opportunities that you may or may not qualify for. So you don't have to read through like the whole website. And then you can pick a year, gives you the state breakdown. And then this, it pulls directly from the 990, which is very nice because it gives you the amount of the gift and everything. And then if you do want to go see the 990 itself, you can by clicking here, and that will just pull up the 990 from that year. So as you can see, I've got, you know, hundreds of matches for this project that I'm working on, and you can go through and narrow it down, and that will provide you just another, and then you can also track your gifts through this as well. Right. So depending on, you say, oh, we're applying for a $5,000 gift, you can use this to sort of be your log of gifts as well. So definitely something to look into. I find them both pretty useful tools when doing grant research. So yeah, shall we move on here? All right. So you've gone through all your research. You've got your however many 150, however many options you have. Now you've got to sort of winnow down your list, right? So again, we can't apply to every single grant that we find because what that is going to do is decrease the amount of time you have to work on each one and won't allow you the time to really tailor, unless you have a really big shop, the time to really tailor each application to the funder. So here's like a little thing that I came up with when I'm trying to determine sort of what to prioritize. If I'm really having a hard time deciding, well, should I apply for this one or this one or this one or this one? So first thing I look at is the history of giving to your organization. If they've given to you before and they haven't said no to another gift, you're definitely going to apply to them. So I give them 6 points. Then you look at the alignments between their giving priorities and your program. If there's a lot of alignment, I give 4 out of 4. If the alignment's a little weaker, so to decrease that, if there's no alignment at all, then that's a big 0. Then look at history of giving to similar organizations. That is an important indicator. They get 3 points for that if they've given to organizations that are similar to your own. Same thing goes for the geographic area, right? And I give another 3 points for that. And then I look at the foundation's board. So is their board representative of the community that the organization is serving? That is a big indicator. If maybe there's someone on your board that has some sort of connection to your board, that might be a useful thing as well. And then responsiveness, right? If you send an email, I usually, when I'm trying to make contact with a new foundation, I usually send an email, I wait a week, I send another email. If I don't get anything by a week or 2 after that, that is an unresponsive funder. Doesn't mean I'm not going to apply to them, but you know, it definitely helps me set my expectations in terms of what I can expect. And yes, there's a call. Instrumentals, I think the annual cost is something like, depending on the plan you get, there's like different plans. I think it's like $1,700 a year or something like that. Something like that. Yeah. So yeah, and then I sort of use this to determine where to rank places on my list of apply to. Just my little formula. All right, so approaching. This is my opportunity to be a pet, right? I guess some people would say you don't want to make a pet of yourself, but what I would say is I'm doing very, very important work as a member of this organization. We need funds to do our work, and we need our philanthropists to be responsive to our work. So I send a lot of emails. I also make phone calls. If I don't get responses to emails, I leave very friendly voicemails with a plea to please call me back. And I do everything I can do before I submit a grant application to have some sort of contact with the person that I'm going to be sending the application to. A site visit where they can actually go and see your program in action is the gold standard, in my opinion. If that's not possible, if you can score an in-person meeting, that's almost just as good. The statistic I found is that 70% of in-person meetings result in a gift. I think that's probably pretty on point. It's much harder for someone to say no when they meet you in person and see all the amazing work that you're doing. If you can't get someone in person, or if it's not feasible, or if they're remote or whatever, a video call or a phone call is good. Email exchange, less so. Obviously, there's just less personality that you can demonstrate through an email. So yeah, the more contact you can have, the better. Thank you, Paula. All right. The next thing you are going to want to look at as you're approaching a new funder is going to be, so you've reached out, you've established contact. They're like, yes, please submit to us. Well, some will have just an application form that you can just fill out and that's the end of it. Others have sort of a two-tier process. This is becoming more common, starting with the letter of intent or the letter of inquiry. Some foundations have a form, usually a short form with a sort of an abridged narrative that you can submit, which will be your letter of intent. This, another important thing to keep in mind here is timeline, right? So it can be anywhere from like 3 to 8 months between when you submit that first part of the application to when you actually get funding, right? So grants are not really the best for like emergency funding. So you can, after you make that contact, submit that letter of intent. But if, let's say, you haven't been able to make any contact with them, they don't have an online form, you can still sort of come up with a free form letter of your own. I would say a page max, just giving like a rundown of your programs, what you might consider asking for, a little introduction, all this information here on the page, the demographics of who you serve, obviously where you're based, a little bit of your history. And you can keep that sort of on file and send it out, with some tweaks to different organizations if they don't have much of an online presence or you can't make contact with them. It's not ideal, but if you really are really having trouble making contact, that's a way to go. So yeah, so there's the letter of inquiry. Now we sort of get to the writing. All right. So in general, an application consists of 4 parts: information about your organization, the narrative, which describes what you're actually asking for, all the budgets and financials, and supporting documentation, which can include any number of things from a strategic plan, a list of programs, an annual report. It runs the gamut. I've seen a whole, sometimes they ask for it's like demographic data, things like that, all kinds of stuff. But these are the 4 basic parts. Now, there's many different approaches to grant writing. There are many people who, conduct grant writing workshops. Most of them are pretty basic. They just talk about, have your data, make sure you proofread, make sure you know your audience, right? Know who you're applying to. And these are all, to me, like very basic things. So when I'm approaching my grant writing, I kind of take all that for granted. And here's the things that, to me, have reaped pretty good results for the organizations that I've worked with in the past. Accomplishments. A is for accomplishments. Yes, you want to make your case as to why you need funds, but what you also don't want to do is let all the deficits, the issues, the obstacles overwhelm what you're talking about. Philanthropists are giving because they know you need money. You really don't have to convince them that you need money. Really, to me, what you're trying to convince them of is that you're going to be good stewards of that money and that you're going to use the funds in an effective way that's going to reap maximum benefits for the people that you serve. So convince them of that. Show them your accomplishments, show them your expertise, and focus on the strength of your organization but also the strength of your community, who you're serving, right? B is for be yourself. This is how you stand out. Every single grant application, I think about it this way. I read for a literary magazine as well, so I read hundreds of short stories and essays every year. And the ones that stand out always have one thing in common. They're told in a voice that no other writer could tell it with. So you've got to sort of let yourself, your personality, your voice, your values come out in the writing somehow. Otherwise, you're just going to blend into the background. C is for concise. Most grant applications have pretty strict character counts on how many letters and spaces you can actually use. But even in grants that allow more space, I still try to keep it as concise as possible. Go through, I actually use Grammarly for this. It's an AI-powered free thing that you can use online. It's good about eliminating like turns of phrase that are kind of clunky, like in lieu of, and things like that, where you can just say, instead of 5 words, you can say the same thing in 1 word. And then, of course, be direct. This is one of the biggest ones I see when I work with a new organization and they're showing me their grant proposals. One of the things that I observe is that there's a lot of hedging, right? There's a lot of we intend to, we aim to, we work to, we will. We will. Just say what you're going to do. I used to be a teacher, and so I think about it as like a lesson plan. At the end of my lesson, my students will be able to sing a B-flat scale, play, a 16th note rhythm, whatever. That is the key to determining your outcomes. Here's a blurb that I pulled out from a grant proposal that was written by someone at an organization that I was brought on to help with their grant writing. So here is the original. It's 915 characters. And here is the revision. Does the same thing, but in half the time. These are the kinds of things I'm talking about when I'm talking about being concise. Maybe I'll just give you a minute to kind of look that over. So again, here's an example for you to try. So I would like you to take a few minutes, look at this example of a unnecessarily verbose response to this question. Describe your organization's commitment to racial equity and economic inclusion. How is this commitment reflected in your organization's activities? Here is a sample response. Maybe we can take a few minutes here and just try to trim that down a little bit. And that will give you maybe a little bit of practice.
And you can put your trimmed versions in the chat.
Oh yeah, excellent, thank you. Not to interrupt anyone, but something I also wanted to mention is that when you're concise, it gives you more room to talk about your accomplishments and the other positive things about your organization. So the less time you spend on the details that are less important, the more time you have to spend on the important details. All right, Paula, shall we move on? I want to give people more time, but I also know we're kind of running against the clock here. Here's a revision that I came up with. I did it in 114 characters. How many characters did you take? All right. I don't want to belabor these points, but I thought I would include them. Awesome. I'm seeing some great responses. Love it. Awesome. This is great. Excellent. Okay. Here's just some, I don't have to sort of spend time going over these, but they're in the presentation for you to refer to. Just again, some ways to, yeah, we will. I always just put that front and center. This is a very wordy slide, but I thought it would be useful to include for your reference. Goals, objectives, and milestones. This is probably one of the things about grant writing that took me the longest to understand. And unfortunately, many grantors use these terms, like goals and objectives are sometimes used interchangeably, but most of the time, a goal is like the big overarching thing that your organization is trying to do, difficult to quantify. The objectives are where the quantitative measures can come in, and the milestones I think about as like checkpoints along the way. So this is kind of a rule of thumb. Some organizations use them differently, but I just thought I'd include that because it was something that always confused the heck out of me. Okay, so now talking about data. If your organization, if it has its own 501c3, should have, so I know that doesn't apply to everyone, sorry, should have a profile on GuideStar that is just waiting for you to claim it. So you don't have to pay, you just need to create an account, you log in, you claim your organization's page, which should already be there because they populate it from tax documents. So if you've got at least 1 year of tax documents, it'll be in there. You claim it. This sometimes takes a few days, FYI, for them to go through and like verify your information. But if you go through and fill out all of the sort of parts of your application, eventually you'll get to the platinum level, which and you can also skip the silver and gold if you want to go right to the platinum, because what it will give you is basically hundreds of different metrics that organizations are known to use. So if you're really struggling and you don't know like what data you may be able to collect, what quantitative data you may be able to collect on a shoestring budget, I would go through to the platinum page on your GuideStar profile and read through and see what the options are, because they may be simpler than you think. Hold on. Okay. Computer is not plugged in. Give me 1 second. Okay. Sorry about that. Thought I plugged that in. All right. So here's just an example. Attendance, enrollment, retention and re-enrollment. That's one that organization I work for said I just started looking at. They realized that from year to year, like 97% of the kids that enrolled like stayed throughout the whole program, which is a really impressive statistic. So anything like that, and there's all kinds of ideas like this in Candid in your GuideStar profile that's just waiting to be populated. You can just sort of type in educational outcomes, attendance outcomes, and you'll get all kinds of ideas like this. When it comes to measuring things like skills development, socio-emotional learning, achievement, that's going to require a more specialized tool, right? So if you work with a school, you can work on maybe developing some sort of MOU with them where they'll share, you know, maybe aggregated achievement data of the students that you serve in your after-school program, things like that. You can work with a nearby university, maybe to figure out, hey, we want to test a student's persistence. What's like a tool that already exists that we could potentially use? And, you know, maybe you can form a partnership that would help guide you through the creation of that kind of tool. All right. We've got to kind of go through this a little bit quick, but the crux of what I wanted to sort of get to here is how to incorporate elements of storytelling into your grant proposals to really make them stand out. But some terminology is important. We say narrative and we say story. They're different things. The narrative is, think about it as like the container for your story. In this case, our narrative is the grant proposal, right? That's the way that we're telling the story. The story itself is the actual content, right, of what we're saying. So our story goes in our narrative. And this is a really clarifying point for me, which is that what actually is a story, right? In movies, right, you can think of a million stories where a parent has to run out and rescue their child, right? All those Liam Neeson movies, Finding Nemo, whatever, The Fugitive, maybe, I don't know, all kinds of movies where parents have to go out and save their kids, right? So, but that story's been done a million times. Why do we keep making that story? Well, it's because of what Vivian Gornick says. The situation is the context or circumstance, the plot, right? Parent has to rescue their kid. That's the plot. But that's not the story. The story is the emotional experience that preoccupies the writer, the insight, the wisdom, the thing one has come to say. The story is the emotional component. And that's the part that we really want to try to work in to our grant proposals. All right. Here's how I suggest that you go about starting to incorporate the elements of story into your grant proposal. The first thing you have to do is come up with your organization's 6-word story. So the 6-word story started apocryphally with Hemingway, who challenged a bunch of his writer friends, probably over some, daiquiris, to write a story with the least number of words with the most emotional impact. So we came up with For Sale, Baby Shoes, never born. 6 words tell the story, right? We don't have any details about who this baby was. We don't have any details about what happened. All we have is the object itself and the emotional attachment that we get when we read it. And I gave you a few other examples. I like the Shonda Rhimes one. The George Takei one is great. And for you, I think for your organization, your 6-word story should encompass something having to do with your mission, your vision, and your values. So that's going to be the first step, is coming up with your 6-word story. Obviously, we're not going to have time for you to create that today, but I hope you will take some time to maybe work, come up with a draft on your own and work with your team, if you have one, to come up with the 6-word story for your organization, and then expand that into the elements that you're going to want to incorporate in your grant proposal. One of the things that you're going to want to do is make your organization the main character, right? Because again, the individuals that you serve, the communities that you serve are important, obviously, and they need to be centered in the work that you're doing. But when it comes to telling the narrative, you really have to sell your organization, because you're the ones that are going to be the stewards of the money. You're going to be the ones that are going to be getting the work done. So that's the first thing to keep in mind. Second, another element of story to keep in mind is the conflict, right? What are the forces that your organization is positioned against? This is where the research comes in. You can pull some nice, statistics, details about the barriers that are faced by the individuals that you serve, the forces that are preventing them from achieving their full potential, whatever it is, and then move from the micro to the macro, right? So you want to show how an individual is impacted by these issues, but also how the community as a whole. I like to approach both, because funders will have an emotional attachment to the individual story, but the population-wide story also has that compelling, more quantitative element to it. So you've presented your character, you've presented your organization as its main character, you've told your story, you've positioned yourself against these forces, and now you have to resolve the tension. And resolving the tension, that is the work that you're going to do. These are your objectives. So your organization is going to overcome these obstacles, barriers, antagonists through X, Y, Z. Objective 1, objective 2, objective 3. And that's where it goes. Another good way to think about this is Christopher Booker's 7 Basic Plots. So this is a pretty well-known book in narratology, the study of how we tell stories. And here's like the 7 basic plots. I think the ones that are most applicable to grant writing in the nonprofit sector are the quest and overcoming the monster. Right? The quest is when a hero or a group of heroes embarks on a journey to find something. They usually end up having to face a lot of obstacles to achieve, to find the Holy Grail or whatever it might be. And then we're also overcoming the monster, right? So this plot is kind of like, I don't know if you're familiar with Beowulf, right? Where the whole point is for the hero to defeat this beast, right? So thinking about the stories that movies, personal narratives, books, the quest and the monsters that you're familiar with, you can incorporate those elements into your stories as well. Again, the whole point of this is to make an emotional connection with the person who's reading your grant proposal. Because at the end of the day, it's not a foundation that's reading the proposal, it's the person who's actually sitting down and reading. All right. So we're at the end of our time here pretty much, but I wanted to leave you with one of my favorite quotes from one of my favorite writers. This is about doing, right? It's not about ideas. It's not about, being cynical, right? It's about doing work. Everyone here is doing work, great work, I'm sure. And I hope that the things you learned today will help you do that work a little more efficiently and effectively.